Good morning, Americans. This is your private alien today, Sunday, uh, June 13th, 2021. Sitting in for Paul Harvey this morning. Stand by for the rest of the story. Well, today's story is on a famous act that was done 158 years ago, and come this past January. And a lot of things has been done. Mr. Harvey did a story on this one, and he called it God's Will. And it's about Abraham Lincoln. And yes, the Emancipation Proclamation. What you don't get is Abraham Lincoln knew that he was going to get a terrible reception on this idea. And he thought of it in September of 1862. He also called his cabinet in. And when they found out the idea, they were stone cold. Mr. President, not even Congress can do this. Yeah. Yeah. What's this going to do? Nothing. And he says, yes, I know it's going to do nothing. But I figure it's my right that God gave me to do this. But what are you going to do after all this? The court's going to overturn it after this war is over. Well, they might. Yes. And it's up to you, the society of the preserved union, to determine what we go after here. Now listen closely, African Americans, okay? Because this affects you and the way you think today. President Lincoln knew that this was going to do absolutely nothing. And sure enough, when it was set in motion on January 1st, 1863, it was delivered to all media around at the time. Print, and it was put on papers and posted on posters all over the place in the North, and in the South it got the usual reaction that they would get. That's not going to do anything. And sure enough, did the Emancipation Proclamation free any slaves? No. Did it get any citizenship for African Americans? No. Did it do anything for them? No. Because you still had another 2 years and 3 months before the war would end. 2 years, 3 months. And some of the people in the South took that as, okay, you're putting this out there, and they took it out on the slaves. Not all, but some. Because there were some ruthless owners there. There was other owners that viewed them as property. And they needed their help to continue on the fight. Because in 1863, that was going to turn out to be a bad year for the South. Up until then, they were winning. So you might say that the Emancipation Proclamation turned the tide of war. But as the Congress, the people in the cabinet told President Lincoln, but you know that the courts can overturn this at the end of the war. And he says, yes. And they said, but what are we going to do with freed slaves at the end of the war? How are we going to handle them? We don't know what to do. And they didn't. How can you integrate a totally different set of people into your society without giving up anything on either side? That was a problem that the persons that were in the cabinet with President Abraham Lincoln. And by the way, Abraham Lincoln signed all his other stuff A. Lincoln. If you look at the proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation, he signed it Abraham Lincoln. That's the only one that he did that to. And he did it because he said that it was his God's will that he did this. It was a divine thing to do. But he had no idea, and he didn't make any ideas on what would happen when the war ended and you had freed slaves. And he didn't have any chance to put any ideas because April 14th, 1865, he was assassinated. A couple of days after the surrender of Appomattox. So he had no chance to put anything in there on how to integrate these people into the American society. And by integrating the African Americans, or slaves as they were called in those days, Negroes, it opened the Pandora's box because you had Chinese that were already in here, and you had other Asians and Latins that were leftovers from the Mexican War 20 years before. So you see Americans sitting in for Paul Harvey today, and I know Mr. Harvey would have loved this piece that he did back in the 1860s or 1960s on the Civil War and God's will. And Abraham Lincoln was probably wrestling with this fact of, how do I handle this? Once the war is over and we win, because he had no quibs about who was going to win. He was going to win and preserve the Union. Did the Union get preserved? Well, yes and no. And President Lincoln, up there with Mr. Paul Harvey right now, can tell you, yeah, once I got assassinated, the radical Republicans took over. And they really messed up the country for the next 150 years. Because that's what they did. They went ahead and gave Abraham Lincoln what he wanted. They gave the African Americans, or slaves, or Negroes, full citizenship, full power in the area that they wanted. And their idea was keep them in the South, give them full power, and stick it to the South. Okay? But unfortunately, politics comes before practical solutions. And that's what you Americans don't have, is practical solutions. You do everything on a political level. And how are you going to integrate them into your society? Well, you couldn't. The North didn't want them integrated as much as the South didn't want them integrated. So for 20 years they were in limbo. They were good in the South. They represented the South in the Congress of the United States. I think there was a few congressmen and a few senators that were African American. But they weren't integrated at all. And then came the election of 1876, which President Lincoln over there with Mr. Harvey and the boss can tell you if they come back and say, see what happens when you don't have a full-fledged idea. President Lincoln had an idea, but he didn't have a chance to take it into fruition because he got assassinated. And the radical Republicans took it in their hands to stick it to the South because they hated them. But then those same radical Republicans in 1876 wanted the presidency at all costs. So for you African Americans that are out there protesting and voting for people like Joe Biden, that party is the one that caused you to be where you were for another 100 years. Segregation and separate but equal came because of that. In 1876, they set up the Compromise of 1877, where the Republicans got the presidency and the Democrats, Redeemers in the South, as they were called, got the South. So it became a solid South. 20 years later, in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, and you had set up Jim Crow laws and equal but separate. Separate but equal. Were you ever equal? No. Were you ever separate? No. You were outcast. And 100 years later, 1865, 1965, you had to do the Voting Rights Act all over again, which Congress had passed in 1865. Why did you have to Congress pass another thing in 1965? Did that end the thing? No. Because you never were integrated into a society. Neither are the Latins or the Asians that are here now. Because you have to give up being black, give up being white, give up being Asian. You have to be Americans and humans. And this all goes back to the Emancipation Proclamation, and Mr. Abraham Lincoln knew that. That's what he tried to tell his cabinet, that you have hard work to do. But nobody listened to him, and here we are 160 some years later, still suffering with the same effects. Sitting in for Paul Harvey, this is your favorite alien. Good day.